Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we are going to examine one of the most genuinely remarkable and most persistently misunderstood figures in the entire span of ancient Egyptian history. Not simply a queen who influenced events from behind the throne, in the manner of some of the royal women we have discussed in our previous explorations of Egyptian history, but a woman who took the full formal titles, the full formal regalia, and the full formal religious authority of Pharaoh itself, ruling Egypt not as a queen consort or as a temporary regent, but as a genuine, fully legitimated king in her own right, for a reign lasting more than 2 decades during one of the most prosperous and most militarily active periods of the entire New Kingdom era. And before we begin, let me tell you 3 things that will stay with you through this entire story. First, Hatshepsut is popularly remembered, when she is remembered at all, primarily as a peaceful builder, a pharaoh who focused her considerable resources on temple construction and on a famous trading expedition to a distant land called Punt, rather than on the kind of military conquest that characterizes the more famous pharaohs we have examined in our previous explorations, including Ramesses II at Kadesh, Ramesses III against the Sea Peoples, and Ahmose during the War of Liberation against the Hyksos. This popular image, while containing genuine truth regarding her building programs and her trading expedition, considerably understates and considerably obscures the genuine military campaigns that Hatshepsut personally authorized and that Egyptian inscriptions from her own reign explicitly credit to her royal leadership, including campaigns against Nubia and against territories in the Levant that required real military planning, real military resources, and real royal authority over Egypt's armed forces. Second, following Hatshepsut's death, her stepson and eventual successor, Thutmose III, whose own extraordinary military career we will examine in a future exploration, undertook a genuinely systematic and genuinely extensive campaign to erase Hatshepsut's memory from the historical and monumental record, having her images chiseled from temple walls, her name removed from official king lists, and her statues, in many documented cases, deliberately smashed and buried. This represents one of the most extensive and most deliberate acts of historical erasure that survives from the ancient world, and modern archaeologists and Egyptologists have spent well over a century piecing together the genuine scope of Hatshepsut's actual reign and actual achievements, specifically by working backward from the fragmentary evidence that this later campaign of erasure failed to completely destroy. Third, the precise motivations behind both Hatshepsut's original assumption of full pharaonic power and Thutmose III's later campaign to erase her memory remain genuinely debated among modern historians, and the answers are considerably more complex than the simple narrative of a vengeful stepson erasing a hated predecessor that popular historical accounts sometimes suggest. Understanding this story requires understanding the genuine complexity of Egyptian succession politics, the genuine religious and ideological challenges that a female pharaoh's rule presented within a system of kingship traditionally understood in explicitly male terms, and the genuine, if still debated, military achievements that this remarkable woman accomplished during her reign, achievements that deserve to be understood on their own terms rather than simply as a footnote to the more famous conquests of her eventual successor. So go ahead and get comfortable. Lights down, blanket up. This one is slow and calm and going nowhere fast. And if you haven't subscribed yet, we're here every night, new story, same pace, lights always low. Let's begin. To understand how Hatshepsut came to assume full pharaonic authority, and to understand the genuine political and military context within which her subsequent reign and her subsequent military campaigns took place, we need to return briefly to the historical foundation we examined in our previous exploration of the war against the Hyksos, because Hatshepsut's own family lineage connects directly back to Ahmose, the pharaoh whose successful war of liberation established the 18th dynasty, and the broader New Kingdom period within which Hatshepsut's own remarkable reign would eventually unfold. Hatshepsut was born into the royal family of this 18th dynasty, the daughter of the pharaoh Thutmose I, a ruler whose own reign, occurring within a few generations of Ahmose's foundational achievements, had continued the pattern of military expansion and consolidated royal authority that characterized this early New Kingdom period. Thutmose I had himself conducted significant military campaigns, extending Egyptian authority southward into Nubia beyond the traditional frontiers that even the Middle Kingdom fortress system we discussed in our previous exploration had established, and northward into the Levantine region, reportedly reaching as far as the Euphrates River itself, an achievement that surviving Egyptian inscriptions describe with evident pride as representing an unprecedented extension of Egyptian military reach into territory that no previous Egyptian pharaoh had directly campaigned within. These campaigns established Thutmose I as one of the most militarily accomplished pharaohs of the early 18th dynasty, and the young Hatshepsut would have grown up within a royal court whose prestige and whose self-understanding were deeply shaped by these genuine, hard-won military achievements, a formative environment that likely shaped her own later understanding of what legitimate, successful pharaonic rule required. Hatshepsut's mother was Ahmose, a royal woman whose name itself reflects the continued prominence of the founding dynasty's naming conventions within this royal family, and whose position as the pharaoh's principal wife established Hatshepsut's own position as a royal daughter of genuinely significant status and genuinely significant religious importance within the Egyptian court. Egyptian royal ideology of this period placed considerable emphasis on the specific religious role of the pharaoh's principal wife, who held the title God's wife of Ammonius, a position carrying genuine religious authority and genuine religious responsibilities connected to the cult of Ammonius at Thebes, the same religious institution whose elevated significance we discussed in our previous exploration as a direct legacy of Thebes's role as the base of operations for the successful war against the Hyksos. This title was not merely honorary. It carried with it specific ritual duties within the Ammonius temple complex at Karnak, specific administrative oversight of temple estates and temple resources, and a level of independent religious authority that provided the woman who held it with genuine institutional standing entirely separate from her relationship to whichever man currently occupied the pharaonic throne. Hatshepsut herself would eventually inherit this significant religious title of God's wife of Ammonius, a position that provided her with genuine institutional authority and genuine religious legitimacy independent of her eventual marriage to her own half-brother, Thutmose II, a marriage consistent with the pattern of royal sibling marriage that characterized Egyptian dynastic practice during this period, a practice intended to maintain the purity and the concentration of royal bloodline in a manner that Egyptian religious and political ideology considered genuinely important for maintaining proper cosmic and dynastic order, even though modern genetic understanding recognizes the genuine biological risks that such consistent close-kin marriage practices carried across successive generations. This specific religious title would prove to be one of the most important foundations of Hatshepsut's later political power, since it gave her direct, independent control over one of the wealthiest and most influential religious institutions in the entire kingdom, a base of institutional and economic power that she could draw upon regardless of the specific political fluctuations of the royal succession itself. Thutmose II's own reign proved to be relatively brief, likely lasting somewhere between 3 and 13 years according to different scholarly reconstructions of the fragmentary chronological evidence, and it produced no surviving son by Hatshepsut herself, though he did father a son, the future Thutmose III, by a secondary wife of lesser status named Isis. When Thutmose II died, this young Thutmose III, still a child at the time of his father's death, likely no more than a toddler or a very young boy, became the formal heir to the Egyptian throne and Hatshepsut, as the young king's stepmother and as a royal woman of genuinely significant status and genuinely significant religious authority in her own right, assumed the position of regent, initially exercising royal authority on behalf of her young stepson in a manner that had established precedent within Egyptian royal tradition, comparable in certain respects to the kind of regency arrangements we discussed regarding Queen Ahotep's own significant role during the early reign of the young Ahmose in our previous exploration of the Hyksos War. What makes Hatshepsut's situation genuinely distinctive, and what sets the stage for the remarkable subsequent developments we are going to examine throughout tonight's story, is that this initial regency arrangement did not remain a temporary, transitional measure pending Thutmose III's eventual maturation into full independent kingship, as Egyptian tradition would ordinarily have anticipated. Instead, at some point during the early years of this regency, generally dated by modern Egyptologists to approximately the 7th year of the young Thutmose III's nominal reign, Hatshepsut took the genuinely unprecedented step of assuming the full formal titles, the full formal regalia, and the full formal religious status of Pharaoh in her own right, ruling not merely as a regent exercising temporary authority on behalf of a child king, but as a fully legitimated co-ruling pharaoh. Alongside her young stepson, a transformation that would establish the genuinely remarkable more than two-decade reign whose military and political achievements we are going to examine in considerable detail throughout the remainder of tonight's story. The precise sequence of steps by which this transformation occurred, whether through a single, decisive act of formal coronation or through a more gradual accumulation of pharaonic titles and pharaonic symbolism over an extended transitional period, remains a subject of ongoing scholarly reconstruction, since the surviving monumental evidence does not provide a single, unambiguous account of exactly how and exactly when this genuinely unprecedented transition occurred. The challenge of female kingship. Let's spend some time now understanding the genuine ideological and religious challenge that Hatshepsut's assumption of full pharaonic authority represented within the broader framework of Egyptian royal ideology, because this challenge, and the specific strategies Hatshepsut employed to address it, help explain many of the genuinely distinctive features of her subsequent reign, including features that directly bear on how we should understand her military campaigns and their historical significance. Egyptian royal ideology, as it had developed over many preceding centuries and as it continued to be understood and articulated throughout the New Kingdom period, conceived of proper pharaonic kingship in explicitly and thoroughly masculine terms. The pharaoh was understood as the living embodiment of the god Horus, the falcon deity associated with kingship and with the specific mythological narrative of a son avenging his murdered father and successfully claiming his rightful inheritance of rule over Egypt. The pharaoh's coronation ceremonies, the pharaoh's ritual responsibilities in maintaining Ma'at, the fundamental cosmic order we discussed extensively in our previous explorations, and the pharaoh's essential military function as the protector of Egypt against chaos and against foreign enemies, were all conceived and articulated within a religious and political framework that assumed and required male kingship as its natural, proper form. The very grammar of the Egyptian language itself, with its distinct masculine and feminine forms for nouns, pronouns, and titles, meant that even the basic linguistic vocabulary available for describing legitimate royal authority carried inherent grammatical gender that Hatshepsut's own unprecedented situation would eventually require creative and sometimes genuinely inconsistent solutions to navigate. This is not to say that Egyptian civilization lacked precedent for significant female political authority. We have discussed, throughout our various explorations of Egyptian history, numerous examples of royal women exercising genuine, significant authority, including Queen Ahotep's apparently significant military and administrative role during the Hyksos War, and the broader pattern of powerful queen mothers and royal wives whose influence, while often exercised through informal channels or through formal regency arrangements, represented genuine and widely recognized forms of female political power within Egyptian society. There existed, moreover, at least one earlier and considerably more obscure precedent for a woman actually assuming formal pharaonic titles, in the figure of Sobonferu, who had ruled briefly at the very end of the Middle Kingdom period some centuries before Hatshepsut's own time, a precedent that Hatshepsut's own court scholars and religious advisors may well have been aware of and may well have drawn upon in constructing the ideological justifications for her own, considerably more extensive and considerably more successful assumption of similar authority. But Hatshepsut's specific innovation, assuming the full formal titles and full formal ritual functions of Pharaoh itself, rather than exercising power through these more established channels of female influence, represented something genuinely without clear, extensive precedent within the preceding history of Egyptian kingship, at least not on the scale and not with the sustained duration that Hatshepsut's own reign would eventually achieve. Hatshepsut's response to this genuine ideological challenge, as revealed through the surviving monumental and textual evidence from her reign, involved a genuinely sophisticated and genuinely multifaceted strategy of religious and political legitimation. Her monuments consistently present her using full traditional pharaonic titulature and full traditional pharaonic religious symbolism, including, in many surviving images, depicting her wearing the traditional false beard and traditional male royal regalia that Egyptian artistic convention associated with proper pharaonic representation, a choice that should be understood not as some form of gender confusion or gender concealment on Hatshepsut's own part, since other surviving inscriptions and other surviving images clearly and explicitly identify her using female pronouns and explicitly acknowledge her female identity, but rather as a deliberate artistic and religious strategy for presenting her legitimate exercise of the specifically male religious office of Pharaoh, an office whose traditional visual and symbolic representation Egyptian artistic convention had developed specifically around male kingship. This artistic strategy evolved over the course of her reign, with earlier monuments showing somewhat more feminine artistic conventions gradually giving way to increasingly standardized, traditionally masculine royal representation as her reign progressed and as her own confidence in and her own court's confidence in her pharaonic legitimacy apparently solidified. The specific inscriptional language used to describe Hatshepsut during her reign reveals this same genuinely complex negotiation between traditional masculine pharaonic convention and acknowledgement of her actual female identity, with texts sometimes employing masculine grammatical forms consistent with traditional pharaonic titulature, and sometimes employing feminine grammatical forms that explicitly acknowledge her female identity, occasionally even within the same inscription, revealing what appears to have been a genuine, ongoing process of linguistic and ideological adaptation rather than a single, fixed, permanently settled solution to this genuinely unprecedented situation. Perhaps most significantly for understanding the broader legitimation strategy of her reign, Hatshepsut commissioned an elaborate series of inscriptions and reliefs, most extensively preserved at her remarkable mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri on the west bank of the Nile near Thebes, presenting a detailed narrative of her own divine birth, claiming that she was the literal physical offspring of the god Ammonius himself, who had, according to this carefully constructed religious narrative, taken the form of her earthly father Thutmose I in order to conceive her with her mother Queen Ahmose, a narrative that directly and explicitly claimed for Hatshepsut the same kind of divine paternal legitimacy that Egyptian royal ideology traditionally reserved for legitimate male pharaonic succession, positioning her not as an unusual or irregular female exception to normal pharaonic succession, but as the specifically divinely chosen and divinely legitimated ruler that the god Ammonius himself had personally selected and personally fathered for this specific purpose. The relief sequence depicting this narrative proceeds through several distinct episodes, including Ammonius' counsel with the other gods regarding his intention to father a great ruler, his visit to Queen Ahmose in the guise of her husband, the specific moment of divine conception, and the eventual presentation of the infant Hatshepsut to the assembled gods, who acknowledge and bless her future role as ruler of Egypt, a narrative sequence that Egyptian artists rendered with genuine visual sophistication and genuine emotional resonance, presenting the divine encounter between Ammonius and Ahmose with a delicacy and a tenderness that ancient viewers would have recognized as expressing genuine religious reverence rather than crude or inappropriate content. This divine birth narrative, preserved in genuinely elaborate and genuinely beautiful relief carvings at Deir el-Bahari, represents one of the most sophisticated pieces of royal religious propaganda surviving from the entire span of ancient Egyptian history, and it illustrates the genuine intellectual and religious sophistication that Hatshepsut and her supporting court officials brought to the genuine challenge of establishing and maintaining her legitimacy as a female pharaoh within a religious and political system that had not previously developed established precedent or established ideological frameworks for accommodating this specific situation. This same sophisticated approach to legitimation, we will see, extended directly into how Hatshepsut's reign presented and commemorated its military achievements that required careful positioning within traditional Egyptian conceptions of proper pharaonic military authority and proper pharaonic military success, conceptions that, like the broader institution of kingship itself, had traditionally been articulated in explicitly masculine terms that her own reign's genuine accomplishments would need to be carefully and deliberately fitted within Egypt's military situation at Hatshepsut's accession. Let's now turn our attention to the specific military and strategic situation that Egypt faced at the time of Hatshepsut's assumption of full pharaonic authority, because understanding this broader context helps illuminate why military campaigns, however much they might seem to contradict her popular reputation as a peaceful, building-focused pharaoh, actually represented a genuinely necessary and genuinely expected component of legitimate pharaonic rule during this specific period of Egyptian history. Egypt at the time of Hatshepsut's accession existed within the broader strategic framework we discussed extensively in our previous exploration of the Battle of Kadesh, a framework in which Egyptian security and Egyptian prosperity depended significantly on maintaining effective control over and effective influence throughout the Nubian territories to the south and the Levantine territories to the north and east, buffer regions whose control Egyptian strategic thinking, shaped by the historical trauma of the Hyksos period we examined in our previous exploration, understood as essential for preventing the kind of foreign political and military buildup that had previously enabled Hyksos domination of Egyptian territory itself. This strategic logic, established through the hard-won experience of the War of Liberation and reinforced through the subsequent decades of consolidation and expansion under Ahmose's immediate successors, had become deeply embedded within Egyptian political and religious ideology by the time Hatshepsut came to exercise pharaonic authority, representing not merely a practical strategic calculation but a genuinely foundational element of what proper, legitimate, successful pharaonic governance was understood to require. Nubia specifically represented an area of particular ongoing strategic concern and particular ongoing military engagement throughout this early New Kingdom period. We discussed, in our previous exploration of the Hyksos War, the significant independent Nubian kingdom of Kerma that had developed during the period of Egyptian weakness and division, and the military campaigns that Ahmose and his immediate successors had conducted to reassert Egyptian authority over this southern frontier region. Hatshepsut's own father, Thutmose I, had continued this pattern of sustained military engagement in Nubia, conducting what surviving inscriptions describe as a particularly severe and particularly decisive campaign that penetrated deep into Nubian territory, an achievement commemorated in specific boundary inscriptions marking the new, considerably expanded southern limit of direct Egyptian territorial control. The specific administrative structure that had developed to govern this Egyptian-controlled Nubian territory, including the position of Viceroy of Kush, a senior royal official specifically responsible for administering and defending this southern frontier region and reporting directly to the pharaoh regarding conditions and developments throughout this often volatile territory, represented an ongoing institutional commitment to sustained military and administrative engagement with this territory that any legitimate Egyptian pharaoh of this period would have been expected to maintain and, when necessary, to actively defend through military action. The specific economic significance of Nubia to the broader Egyptian state further reinforced the strategic and political necessity of maintaining active military control over this territory. Nubian gold mines represented one of the most significant sources of this precious metal available to the Egyptian state, funding not merely the elaborate royal building projects and elaborate royal burial equipment that we have discussed extensively throughout our various previous explorations of Egyptian civilization, but also the broader administrative and military apparatus that sustained Egyptian state power more generally. Nubia additionally served as a crucial trade corridor connecting Egypt to the broader sub-Saharan African trading networks that supplied ivory, ebony, exotic animals, and various other luxury goods that Egyptian elite culture particularly prized, meaning that effective Egyptian control over this territory carried genuine, substantial economic significance well beyond its purely symbolic or purely ideological importance within the broader framework of proper pharaonic frontier security. The Levantine frontier, similarly, represented an area of ongoing strategic significance, though the specific character of Egyptian engagement in this northern region during Hatshepsut's reign appears to have been somewhat less militarily intensive than the sustained campaigns that would characterize the subsequent reign of Thutmose III, whose own extensive military campaigns throughout this region, including the historically significant Battle of Megiddo that we will examine in a future exploration, would establish a genuinely unprecedented extent of direct Egyptian military and political authority throughout the broader Levantine region. This relative difference in the intensity of military engagement between these two frontier regions during Hatshepsut's reign likely reflects genuine strategic assessment regarding where active Egyptian military resources needed to be most directly concentrated during this specific period, rather than any fundamental disinterest in or fundamental neglect of Egypt's broader strategic interests throughout the Levantine region more generally. This broader strategic context helps explain why the surviving evidence for military activity during Hatshepsut's own reign, evidence we will examine in considerable detail throughout the remainder of tonight's story, should not be understood as somehow anomalous or inconsistent with her broader reputation as a builder and as a sponsor of peaceful trade expeditions like the famous journey to Punt. Rather, this military activity represents the genuinely necessary and genuinely expected fulfillment of one of the pharaoh's most fundamental traditional responsibilities, the maintenance of Egyptian security and Egyptian authority throughout the frontier regions whose control Egyptian strategic thinking, particularly following the trauma of the Hyksos period, understood as essential for the kingdom's broader security and broader prosperity, the very prosperity that would, in turn, fund and enable the kind of extensive building programs and extensive trading expeditions for which Hatshepsut's reign has become more popularly known. The Nubian campaigns. Let's now examine in detail the specific evidence we possess regarding Hatshepsut's military campaigns in Nubia, evidence that, while considerably less extensive and considerably less dramatically documented than the kind of elaborate royal battle narratives we examined regarding Ramesses II at Kadesh or Ramesses III against the Sea Peoples, nonetheless provides genuine and genuinely significant confirmation that Hatshepsut personally authorized and personally claimed credit for real military action during her reign. Our evidence for these Nubian campaigns comes from several distinct sources, including inscriptions at various sites throughout Nubia itself, references within the tomb inscriptions of officials who served during Hatshepsut's reign, and specific textual and visual evidence from her own monuments at Thebes. One particularly significant piece of evidence comes from an inscription at the site of Sihel Island, near the traditional Egyptian frontier fortress town of Aswan, recording a military campaign against Nubian territory that explicitly credits Hatshepsut with personal authorization and personal royal responsibility for this military action, describing the campaign in language that, while considerably more concise than the elaborate narrative accounts we have examined regarding later New Kingdom military campaigns, nonetheless clearly establishes genuine military engagement rather than simply routine administrative oversight of an already pacified and already securely controlled frontier region. The inscription's specific language, describing the pharaoh's personal role in ordering and overseeing this campaign, follows the traditional formulaic conventions that Egyptian royal military inscriptions had developed over previous generations, applying to Hatshepsut the same basic vocabulary of royal military authority and royal military achievement that Egyptian tradition had traditionally reserved for male pharaonic predecessors. Additional evidence for Hatshepsut's Nubian military engagement comes from the tomb of an official named Jehudi, who served during her reign and whose tomb inscription includes reference to military honors and military recognition received in connection with campaigns conducted during Hatshepsut's rule, including specific reference to the presentation of gold, the same kind of formal military decoration system we discussed extensively regarding the soldier Amos, son of Abana's own military career during the earlier Hyksos War, suggesting that this established Egyptian military honor system continued to operate and continued to recognize genuine battlefield achievement during Hatshepsut's own reign, evidence that would be difficult to explain if her reign had genuinely been characterized by the kind of complete military inactivity that her popular reputation as a purely peaceful, building-focused pharaoh might otherwise suggest. This continuity of the established military honor system across successive reigns, from the early 18th dynasty through Hatshepsut's own rule, demonstrates a genuine institutional continuity within the Egyptian military apparatus that transcended the specific gender-based ideological questions surrounding her own particular assumption of pharaonic authority, suggesting that whatever theological or ideological adjustments her reign required in other domains, the fundamental operation of Egypt's military institutions and Egypt's military reward systems continued functioning according to established traditional patterns. The specific scale and specific intensity of these Nubian campaigns remains somewhat difficult to precisely establish given the relatively limited and relatively fragmentary nature of the surviving textual evidence, a limitation that connects to the broader pattern we discussed regarding the challenges of reconstructing certain periods of ancient Egyptian military history from incomplete source material. What does seem reasonably clear from the available evidence is that these campaigns were not conducted as some kind of purely nominal or purely symbolic royal military gesture, but represented genuine military engagement against genuine Nubian resistance or genuine Nubian threat to established Egyptian frontier control, requiring the kind of real military planning, real resource mobilization, and real royal authorization that any legitimate exercise of pharaonic military authority during this period would have required. The logistics of conducting military operations in Nubian territory, requiring the transport of troops, supplies, and equipment along the Nile's southern reaches, through and beyond the specific cataract regions whose navigational challenges we touched upon in our discussion of the earlier Middle Kingdom fortress system, represented a genuinely significant administrative and organizational undertaking regardless of the specific scale of the resulting military engagement itself. Some modern Egyptologists have suggested that these Nubian campaigns may have been conducted relatively early within Hatshepsut's period of exercising royal authority, potentially even during the initial phase of her formal regency on behalf of the young Thutmose III before her own subsequent assumption of full pharaonic titles and full pharaonic status, a chronological possibility that, if accurate, would suggest that Hatshepsut's demonstrated capacity for effective military leadership. An effective military authorization may have itself represented one of the specific factors that contributed to the broader political and religious legitimation process that eventually supported her transition from temporary regent to fully established, co-ruling pharaoh. Under this interpretation, successful military leadership, demonstrating her genuine capacity to fulfill one of the pharaoh's most fundamental traditional responsibilities, would have provided genuinely important practical and political support for the more elaborate religious and ideological legitimation strategies, including the divine birth narrative we discussed in the previous section, that her subsequent monuments would work to establish and reinforce. This interpretation, connecting demonstrated military competence to the broader process of establishing her extraordinary pharaonic legitimacy, finds additional support in the broader pattern we have observed throughout our various explorations of Egyptian history, in which successful military leadership consistently functioned as one of the most powerful and most widely recognized sources of royal legitimacy and royal prestige, from Amos's foundational military achievements during the Hyksos war through the extensive military conquests of later New Kingdom pharaohs, including Ramesses II and Ramesses III. If Hatshepsut and her supporting court officials understood and deliberately utilized this same fundamental principle, employing genuine, demonstrated military success in Nubia as part of the broader foundation supporting her genuinely unprecedented claim to full pharaonic authority, this would represent a genuinely sophisticated and genuinely effective political strategy, one that helps explain how she was ultimately able to achieve and sustain more than 2 decades of successful, broadly accepted pharaonic rule despite the genuine ideological challenges that her position as a female ruler within this traditionally male-defined institution otherwise presented. The question of the Levantine campaign. Let's now turn our attention to the more genuinely debated question of whether Hatshepsut conducted any significant military campaigns in the Levantine region, a question that has generated considerably more scholarly discussion and considerably more scholarly disagreement than the relatively more straightforward evidence we have examined regarding her Nubian military engagement. The traditional scholarly consensus regarding Hatshepsut's reign, developed primarily during earlier periods of Egyptological research and reflecting, at least in part, the genuinely limited textual and archaeological evidence available for detailed reconstruction of this specific reign, generally held that Hatshepsut's reign was characterized by relative military passivity in the Levantine region specifically, with the genuinely extensive Egyptian military campaigns throughout this territory, that we associate with the New Kingdom, period more properly understood as beginning in earnest only following her death, when her stepson Thutmose III assumed sole, independent pharaonic authority and began the extensive series of military campaigns, including the historically significant Battle of Megiddo, that would eventually establish Egyptian imperial authority throughout much of the Levantine region. This traditional interpretation, developed by generations of earlier Egyptologists working with the evidence available to them at the time, understandably shaped much of the broader popular and even scholarly characterization of Hatshepsut's reign as fundamentally more peaceful and fundamentally less militarily expansionist than either the preceding reign of her father Thutmose I or the subsequent, considerably more extensively documented reign of her stepson. More recent scholarship, however, drawing on careful re-examination of the available evidence and on ongoing archaeological research throughout the broader region, has increasingly suggested that this traditional picture of complete Levantine military passivity during Hatshepsut's reign may require meaningful revision. Some fragmentary textual evidence, including references within tomb inscriptions of officials who served during her reign, suggests possible military activity or at least military preparation directed toward Levantine territory during Hatshepsut's own rule, though the specific scale, specific character, and specific chronological placement of any such activity remains considerably less clearly established than the more concrete evidence we possess regarding her Nubian campaigns. Some scholars have pointed to specific inscriptional references to military activity in the region of Gaza and along the traditional coastal route into Canaan that Egyptian armies had used for generations. References that, while genuinely fragmentary and genuinely difficult to definitively date with complete confidence to her specific reign, nonetheless suggest that the traditional narrative of complete Levantine inactivity may understate the genuine complexity of Egypt's ongoing engagement with this frontier region throughout her rule. One particularly interesting piece of evidence that bears on this question involves the specific military and political situation that Thutmose III encountered immediately upon assuming sole, independent authority following Hatshepsut's death, a situation that led directly to his famous campaign culminating in the Battle of Megiddo. The specific circumstances of this campaign, which we will examine in considerably greater detail in a future exploration dedicated specifically to Thutmose III's own remarkable military career, involved suppressing what Egyptian sources describe as a significant coalition of rebellious Levantine city-states and local rulers who had apparently ceased acknowledging Egyptian authority and Egyptian tribute obligations, a situation that some modern historians have suggested may reflect a genuine reduction in active Egyptian military presence and active Egyptian military enforcement throughout this region during at least the latter portion of Hatshepsut's own reign, whether due to her own strategic priorities favoring the kind of building programs and trading expeditions for which she is more popularly remembered, or due to other factors that the surviving evidence does not allow us to fully establish with complete confidence. This particular interpretation, connecting the scale of the rebellion Thutmose III faced to a hypothesized reduction in Egyptian military presence during the final years of Hatshepsut's reign, deserves careful scrutiny rather than uncritical acceptance, since rebellions and coalitions of resistance against imperial authority can develop for numerous reasons entirely independent of any specific reduction in the imperial power's own military activity, including simply the natural political dynamics of vassal states periodically testing and periodically challenging imperial authority regardless of how consistently or how vigorously that authority had previously been enforced. The genuinely significant scale of the coalition Thutmose III confronted at Megiddo, involving numerous separate Levantine rulers acting in apparent coordination, could equally plausibly reflect the natural accumulation of resentment against sustained Egyptian tribute demands across an extended period, reaching a critical mass of coordinated resistance regardless of the specific, year-by-year intensity of Egyptian military enforcement during any particular preceding period. This question of relative Levantine military activity or passivity during Hatshepsut's reign connects to a broader, genuinely important historiographical issue that responsible historians must carefully navigate. Distinguishing between the genuine, positive evidence we possess for specific military campaigns, such as the Nubian evidence we examined in the previous section, and the more speculative inferences that historians sometimes draw from the relative absence of evidence for military activity in other specific regions or during other specific periods. The relative scarcity of explicit textual evidence for major Levantine military campaigns during Hatshepsut's own reign does not necessarily prove the complete absence of any such military activity, but it does appear to support the broader conclusion that whatever military engagement did occur in the specific region during her rule was considerably less extensive and considerably less systematically documented and commemorated than either her own more clearly established Nubian campaigns or the subsequent, considerably more extensive Levantine campaigns that her stepson Thutmose III would conduct following her death. Deir el-Bahari and the military narrative in stone. Let's spend considerable time now examining Hatshepsut's remarkable mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, because this extraordinary architectural and artistic achievement provides us with our single most extensive body of evidence regarding how Hatshepsut herself chose to present and commemorate her reign's achievements, including, alongside the more famous depictions of her divine birth narrative and her celebrated expedition to Punt, genuine evidence regarding how military achievement fit within her broader program of royal self-presentation and royal legitimation. The temple itself, designed by Hatshepsut's chief architect and royal steward Senenmut, whose own historical significance and whose own genuinely close relationship with Hatshepsut has generated considerable scholarly discussion and considerable scholarly speculation, represents one of the most architecturally innovative and most visually striking monuments surviving from the entire span of ancient Egyptian architectural history, constructed as a series of terraced colonnades built directly into the dramatic limestone cliffs of the Theban necropolis, a specific architectural setting that both harmonized with the sacred natural landscape of this significant religious site and provided an extensive series of wall surfaces perfectly suited to the elaborate program of relief carving and inscription that Hatshepsut commissioned to commemorate and to legitimate her remarkable reign. The temple's design incorporates 3 distinct terraces, each connected by monumental ramps, with the overall composition creating a genuinely dramatic processional sequence that would have guided ancient visitors through an increasingly sacred and increasingly elevated series of spaces, culminating in the innermost sanctuary carved directly into the living rock of the cliff face itself, a design choice that connected Hatshepsut's own mortuary cult directly to the sacred landscape of Thebes in a manner that reinforced the broader religious and ideological claims her monuments worked to establish throughout the site. While the temple's most famous surviving reliefs depict the divine birth narrative we discussed earlier and the celebrated trading expedition to the land of Punt, a genuinely remarkable maritime journey to a distant territory, likely located somewhere along the African coast of the Red Sea region, that brought back exotic goods including mertrees, ivory, gold, and various animals that Egyptian artists depicted with genuinely vivid and genuinely detailed attention. The temple's broader decorative program also includes evidence connecting to military and frontier security themes that deserve genuine scholarly attention alongside these more famous and more extensively studied elements of the temple's decoration. Specific sections of the temple's decorative program include depictions and inscriptions connecting to Hatshepsut's Nubian military engagement, presenting her, consistent with traditional Egyptian pharaonic artistic convention, in the role of military victor and military protector of Egyptian frontier security, employing the same basic visual and symbolic vocabulary that Egyptian royal art had traditionally used to depict legitimate pharaonic military achievement, even while adapting certain specific elements of this traditional presentation to accommodate her own specific circumstances as a female ruler exercising this traditionally male royal function. These reliefs, though considerably less extensively preserved and considerably less extensively studied than the more famous Punt expedition sequence, employ traditional smiting scenes, the conventional Egyptian artistic motif depicting the pharaoh raising a weapon against a kneeling, defeated foreign enemy, a visual formula that Egyptian royal art had used to represent pharaonic military triumph for many centuries before Hatshepsut's own reign, and that her own monuments continued to employ in presenting her own military achievements, demonstrating her court's evident determination to present her military authority using precisely the same visual vocabulary that legitimate male pharaonic predecessors had traditionally employed. This military dimension of the Deir el-Bahari decorative program, while genuinely less extensive and genuinely less visually dominant than the more famous Punt expedition reliefs or the divine birth narrative, nonetheless represents a genuinely important piece of evidence for understanding how Hatshepsut herself, and the court officials and religious authorities who supported her reign, understood and presented the relationship between her more famous peaceful achievements and the genuine military dimension of her broader exercise of pharaonic authority. Rather than representing some kind of fundamental contradiction or fundamental tension between peaceful, building-focused governance and traditional pharaonic military responsibility, the temple's broader decorative program appears to present these different dimensions of her reign as complementary and mutually reinforcing aspects of a single, comprehensive vision of successful, legitimate pharaonic rule, in which effective military maintenance of frontier security and effective military protection of Egyptian territorial integrity provided the essential foundation and essential precondition for the kind of prosperous, stable conditions that could then support the extensive building programs and extensive peaceful trading expeditions for which her reign has become more popularly and more extensively remembered. The temple's architecture itself, incorporating specific ritual spaces dedicated to various deities, including a specific chapel dedicated to the war-associated deity Anubis alongside spaces dedicated to Hathor and to the divine birth narrative we discussed earlier, reflects this broader integration of martial and peaceful themes within a single, comprehensive religious and architectural program, presenting Hatshepsut's reign not as a simple binary choice between military conquest and peaceful prosperity, but as a genuinely comprehensive exercise of the full range of traditional pharaonic responsibilities, including both the martial protection of Egyptian security and the peaceful cultivation of Egyptian prosperity and Egyptian religious devotion that her more famous monuments and more famous achievements more prominently celebrate. The specific placement of these different thematic elements throughout the temple's overall architectural sequence, with certain themes more prominently featured on the lower, more publicly accessible terraces and other, more esoteric religious content reserved for the innermost, most sacred spaces, reflects a genuinely sophisticated understanding of how different audiences, ranging from ordinary visitors to the temple's precincts through to the most senior priests permitted access to its innermost sanctuaries, would encounter and would understand the different dimensions of Hatshepsut's carefully constructed royal self-presentation. Senenmut and the administration of power. Let's spend some time now with Senenmut, the architect responsible for Deir el-Bahari's remarkable design, and more broadly with the administrative structure and the specific personnel who supported Hatshepsut's exercise of pharaonic authority throughout her reign, because understanding this broader administrative apparatus helps illuminate how a female pharaoh, operating within the specific ideological and religious challenges we discussed in Part 2, successfully maintained effective governance, including effective military authority, across more than 2 decades of sustained rule. Senenmut himself represents one of the most genuinely fascinating and most extensively documented officials from the entire span of ancient Egyptian history, rising from what appears to have been comparatively modest social origins to become one of the most powerful and most trusted figures within Hatshepsut's royal court, holding numerous significant titles and significant administrative responsibilities, including specific responsibility for overseeing royal building projects, specific religious responsibilities connected to the cult of Ammonius, and, in a detail that has attracted particular scholarly and popular attention, apparent personal responsibility for the upbringing and education of Hatshepsut's own daughter, Neferur, a role that some surviving inscriptions and surviving artistic depictions present with genuine warmth and genuine personal intimacy, showing Senenmut depicted holding the young princess in a manner that suggests a considerably closer and considerably more personal relationship than the purely formal, purely administrative connection that his official titles alone might otherwise suggest. Senenmut's surviving inscriptions list an extraordinary accumulation of formal titles, reportedly numbering more than 80 distinct offices and honors across the course of his career, an accumulation of authority and responsibility that reflects the genuine trust and genuine reliance that Hatshepsut placed in this particular official throughout the majority of her reign. The precise nature of Senenmut's relationship with Hatshepsut herself has generated considerable scholarly speculation, including specific theories suggesting a romantic or sexual relationship between the two, speculation that draws partly on the genuine closeness and genuine trust that his numerous significant appointments clearly reflect, and partly on certain specific pieces of circumstantial evidence, including a somewhat crude graffito discovered near the Deir el-Bahri temple site, depicting what some scholars have interpreted as a sexualized image possibly intended to represent Hatshepsut and Senenmut, though the specific interpretation and specific significance of this particular piece of evidence remains genuinely debated among specialists, with considerable scholarly disagreement regarding whether it represents genuine contemporary commentary on their actual relationship or, alternatively, some other form of artistic or satirical expression whose precise original meaning and precise original context remains difficult to establish with confidence based on the fragmentary evidence alone. Responsible modern Egyptology generally treats this specific speculation with appropriate caution, recognizing the genuine limits of what circumstantial evidence of this kind can definitively establish regarding the actual private lives and actual private relationships of historical figures separated from us by more than 3,000 years. Beyond the specific question of his personal relationship with Hatshepsut, Senenmut's broader career illustrates something genuinely important about the administrative strategy that supported Hatshepsut's successful, sustained exercise of pharaonic authority. Her apparent willingness to elevate and to rely upon capable officials whose personal loyalty and personal competence she could trust, regardless of their specific social origins, a pattern that, while not entirely without precedent in earlier Egyptian administrative practice, appears to have been particularly pronounced and particularly consequential during her own reign, potentially reflecting the specific political necessity of building a genuinely loyal and genuinely capable administrative apparatus to support her own somewhat unprecedented assumption of full pharaonic authority. This strategy of promoting officials based on demonstrated competence and demonstrated personal loyalty, rather than purely on established aristocratic pedigree, While not unique to Hatshepsut's reign within the broader sweep of Egyptian administrative history, appears to have taken on particular significance during her own rule, potentially reflecting a genuine political calculation that officials who owed their own elevated positions specifically and personally to her own patronage would have. Particularly strong incentive to remain genuinely loyal to and genuinely supportive of her own, somewhat unprecedented claim to pharaonic authority. Beyond Senenmut himself, Hatshepsut's broader administration included numerous other officials whose own surviving tomb inscriptions and surviving monuments provide additional evidence for the genuine scope and genuine effectiveness of her government, including officials responsible for treasury administration, officials responsible for overseeing the various construction projects that her extensive building program required, and, as we discussed in Part 4, officials like Jehudi whose military honors provide direct evidence for the genuine operation of Egypt's military reward and recognition system throughout her reign. This broader administrative apparatus, including Senenmut alongside these numerous other officials, would have been essential for the successful conduct of the military campaigns we discussed in earlier sections of tonight's story, since effective military action, as we have discussed extensively throughout our previous explorations of Egyptian military history, required genuine logistical coordination, genuine resource mobilization, and genuine administrative capacity extending well beyond the specific individuals who might lead troops directly into combat. The evidence we examined regarding the official Jehudi's military honors, discussed in Part 4, represents just one example of the broader pattern of capable officials whose service, whether in specifically military capacities or in the broader administrative apparatus that supported military action, helped make Hatshepsut's successful, sustained exercise of pharaonic authority, including its genuine military dimensions, actually achievable in practice. The genuine sophistication and genuine effectiveness of this broader administrative apparatus, evident across the full range of achievements we have examined throughout tonight's story, from the successful conduct of military campaigns through the successful organization of the ambitious Punt expedition to the successful completion of the extensive building program that Deir el-Bahari itself represents, provides important context for understanding how a female pharaoh, operating within the genuine ideological challenges we discussed in Part 2, was nonetheless able to achieve more than 2 decades of genuinely successful, genuinely productive rule over ancient Egypt. The Punt expedition in strategic context. Let's now turn our attention to Hatshepsut's most famous non-military achievement, the celebrated trading expedition to the land of Punt, because understanding this expedition within its broader strategic and economic context helps illuminate how even Hatshepsut's most peaceful and most celebrated achievement connected to and depended upon the broader framework of Egyptian military and political power that we have been examining throughout tonight's story. The land of Punt, whose precise geographic location remains a subject of ongoing scholarly discussion, with most modern historians favoring some location along the African coast of the Red Sea region, possibly encompassing territory in what is now Eritrea, Djibouti, Somalia, or Sudan, had long represented, according to surviving Egyptian textual and artistic evidence extending back well before Hatshepsut's own reign, a significant source of specific luxury and specific religious goods that Egyptian civilization particularly valued, including myrrh and frankincense, essential ingredients for the elaborate religious rituals and the elaborate mummification practices we examined extensively in our earlier exploration of Egyptian mummification, along with gold, ebony, ivory, and various exotic animals that Egyptian elite culture prized as markers of genuine royal wealth and genuine royal access to distant, exotic territories. Earlier Egyptian pharaohs, extending back to the Old Kingdom period many centuries before Hatshepsut's own reign, had periodically organized similar trading expeditions to this same distant territory, meaning that Hatshepsut's own famous journey, while genuinely remarkable in its specific scale and in the genuinely detailed commemorative record she commissioned to document it, represented a continuation and a revival of established Egyptian trading tradition rather than an entirely unprecedented innovation. Hatshepsut's expedition to Punt, conducted apparently during approximately the 9th year of her reign, represented a genuinely significant maritime undertaking, requiring the construction and provisioning of a fleet of ships capable of navigating the Red Sea and reaching this distant territory, along with the assembly of trade goods that Egyptian merchants would offer in exchange for the specific goods they sought to acquire. The Deir el-Bahari reliefs depicting this expedition provide us with genuinely remarkable visual detail regarding both the specific goods exchanged and the specific character of the Puntite people and Puntite territory that Egyptian artists depicted, including detailed images of Puntite dwellings built on stilts, specific Puntite flora and fauna, and a notably detailed and notably respectful depiction of the ruler of Punt and his wife, whose specific physical characteristics Egyptian artists rendered with genuine ethnographic attention rather than the kind of generic or stereotyped depiction that Egyptian art sometimes applied to foreign peoples encountered primarily through military conflict rather than peaceful trade. The reliefs additionally depict the specific loading of the Egyptian ships for their return journey, showing sailors carefully transporting live mertries, their root balls wrapped for the long sea voyage, along with baskets of incense, stacks of ebony logs, and cages containing various exotic animals, providing modern researchers with genuinely valuable ethnographic and economic detail regarding the specific character of this ancient trading relationship. This expedition, however genuinely peaceful in its immediate character, depended significantly on the broader framework of Egyptian military and political power that secured the necessary logistical infrastructure, including secure access to Red Sea ports and secure control over the specific overland routes connecting these ports to the Nile Valley itself, infrastructure that Egyptian military presence throughout the eastern desert region, including specific fortified way stations and specific security arrangements, helped maintain and helped protect. The broader pattern of sustained military engagement in Nubia that we examined in Part 4, securing Egyptian control over the southern frontier region through which certain overland trade routes to the Red Sea coast likely passed, similarly provided essential strategic context supporting the kind of secure, stable conditions that made an ambitious maritime trading expedition like the Punt journey practically achievable. The specific administrative and logistical coordination required to construct an ocean-going fleet, to transport the necessary construction materials and the necessary trade goods across the eastern desert to the Red Sea coast, and to successfully organize and supply an extended maritime journey to a distant, only intermittently visited territory, represented a genuinely impressive demonstration of Egyptian state capacity and Egyptian administrative sophistication, achievements that depended directly on the same broader institutional and administrative apparatus, including figures like Senenmut, whom we discussed in the previous section, that also supported Hatshepsut's military campaigns and her extensive building programs. This connection between Hatshepsut's celebrated peaceful trading achievement and the broader military and security framework that enabled it illustrates a genuinely important point that deserves emphasis as we work to develop a more complete and more historically accurate understanding of her reign. The traditional popular narrative that presents Hatshepsut as somehow representing a purely peaceful alternative to the more militaristic pharaohs whose conquests we have examined in our previous explorations creates a somewhat false and somewhat misleading dichotomy. her reign's genuine achievements, including both the celebrated peaceful trading expedition to Punt and the genuine military campaigns we have documented in Nubia, represent complementary rather than contradictory dimensions of a single, comprehensive exercise of traditional pharaonic authority, an authority that, as we have discussed throughout our various explorations of Egyptian history, traditionally encompassed both the martial protection of Egyptian security and the peaceful cultivation of Egyptian prosperity as equally essential and mutually reinforcing components of legitimate, successful royal rule. Thutmose III's long wait. Let's now turn our attention to Thutmose III himself during the more than 2 decades of Hatshepsut's reign, because understanding his own position and his own experience during this extended period helps illuminate the genuinely complex political dynamics that characterize this co-regency arrangement, and provides important context for understanding the subsequent campaign of erasure that he would undertake following Hatshepsut's eventual death. The surviving evidence regarding Thutmose III's specific position and specific activities during Hatshepsut's reign presents a somewhat complex and somewhat ambiguous picture. He continued to be formally acknowledged as co-ruling pharaoh throughout this period, with his own name and his own titles appearing alongside Hatshepsut's on various monuments and various official inscriptions, and surviving evidence indicates that he received genuine military training and genuine military experience during this period, potentially including participation in at least some of the military campaigns we discussed in earlier sections of tonight's story, experience that would prove genuinely significant in preparing him for the extraordinarily active and extraordinarily successful independent military career that he would go on to pursue following Hatshepsut's death. Egyptian tradition placed considerable importance on the practical military education of young royal men, and surviving evidence, including later inscriptions describing Thutmose III's own physical prowess and personal military capabilities, suggests that his extended youth during Hatshepsut's reign involved genuine, substantive training in the martial and administrative skills that effective pharaonic leadership required, rather than representing simply an extended, idle period of purely ceremonial subordination. The precise nature of the actual power-sharing arrangement between Hatshepsut and her young stepson, and the precise degree to which Thutmose III genuinely participated in or was genuinely excluded from meaningful exercise of royal authority during this extended period, remains a subject of genuine scholarly discussion and genuine scholarly disagreement. Some historians have emphasized evidence suggesting a genuinely collaborative co-regency arrangement, in which Hatshepsut, while clearly exercising the dominant senior role in royal governance, nonetheless maintained genuine acknowledgement of Thutmose's own legitimate co-ruling status and provided him with genuine opportunities for meaningful military and administrative experience and development throughout this period. Experience that would explain the genuinely impressive competence and genuinely impressive strategic sophistication that he would demonstrate immediately upon assuming sole, independent authority. Under this more collaborative interpretation, the extended co-regency period would represent something closer to an unusually prolonged but genuinely functional mentorship arrangement, with Hatshepsut effectively grooming her eventual successor for the independent military and administrative responsibilities he would eventually assume. Other historians have emphasized evidence suggesting a more genuinely subordinate and potentially more genuinely frustrating position for the young Thutmose during this extended period, pointing to the relative prominence of Hatshepsut's own name, titles, and image across the surviving monumental record from this period, particularly at prominent sites like Deir el-Bahari, as evidence that Hatshepsut, whatever the formal acknowledgement of Thutmose's co-ruling status, in practice exercised considerably more dominant and considerably more comprehensive actual authority throughout this extended period, potentially creating genuine tension and genuine resentment that some historians have suggested may have contributed to the subsequent campaign of monumental erasure that Thutmose would undertake following her eventual death. Under this alternative interpretation, the extended more than two-decade period during which the young Thutmose remained formally subordinate to his stepmother's dominant exercise of pharaonic authority, despite his own biological claim to sole succession and despite his own presumably growing capability and growing ambition as he progressed from childhood through adolescence into full adulthood, would represent a genuine source of accumulated personal and political frustration that could plausibly have motivated at least some portion of his subsequent systematic campaign to erase her memory from the historical record. This question of the precise emotional and political dynamic between Hatshepsut and her stepson during this extended co-regency period connects directly to the broader, genuinely debated question of exactly why Thutmose III undertook his subsequent campaign of systematically erasing Hatshepsut's memory from the historical and monumental record, a campaign we will examine in considerably greater detail in the following section, and a campaign whose precise motivations, as we noted at the very beginning of tonight's story, remain genuinely more complex and genuinely more debated among modern historians than any simple narrative of straightforward vengeful resentment would suggest. What seems reasonably clear from the available evidence, regardless of which specific interpretation of the underlying emotional and political dynamic proves most accurate, is that Thutmose III emerged from this extended co-regency period with genuinely impressive military and administrative capabilities that he would demonstrate almost immediately upon assuming sole, independent authority through the launch of his own extensive series of military campaigns throughout the Levantine region, campaigns whose genuine scale and genuine sophistication we will examine in considerable detail in a future dedicated exploration of his own remarkable military career. The Campaign of Erasure. Let's now examine in detail the genuinely remarkable and genuinely extensive campaign that Thutmose III undertook, at some point following Hatshepsut's death, to systematically remove her image, her name, and her memory from Egypt's monumental and historical record, a campaign whose genuine scope and genuine systematic character modern archaeological and Egyptological research has gradually revealed through more than a century of careful study and careful reconstruction. The physical evidence for this campaign of erasure is genuinely extensive and genuinely striking. Hatshepsut's images at numerous temple sites throughout Egypt, including significant portions of the decorative program at her own celebrated mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, show clear evidence of deliberate chiseling and deliberate defacement, with her carved image systematically removed from wall surfaces while the surrounding decorative program often remained otherwise intact, a pattern that clearly indicates deliberate, targeted removal of her specific image rather than any form of general random damage or general random deterioration of the kind that might result from purely natural or purely accidental causes. Her cartouches, the specific oval-shaped hieroglyphic symbols that traditionally enclosed a pharaoh's formal royal name, were similarly targeted for systematic removal at numerous sites, with her name frequently replaced with the names of other pharaohs, including, in some specific cases, her own father Thutmose I, her deceased husband Thutmose II, or Thutmose III himself, effectively rewriting the historical record to obscure or eliminate any acknowledgement of her own independent reign. Statues of Hatshepsut, including numerous examples excavated from the vicinity of Deir el-Bahari itself, show evidence of deliberate destruction, with many examples discovered broken into multiple pieces and, in several documented cases, apparently deliberately buried in specific disposal pits rather than simply left in place following their destruction, a pattern of deliberate disposal that suggests a genuinely systematic and genuinely organized campaign of removal rather than simple random vandalism or opportunistic destruction. Modern archaeological reconstruction of these shattered and buried statue fragments has represented a genuinely significant undertaking, with Egyptologists working over many decades to piece together fragmentary evidence recovered from these disposal contexts in order to reconstruct our modern understanding of Hatshepsut's original monumental self-presentation, a painstaking process of careful excavation, careful cataloging, and careful physical reassembly that has gradually allowed numerous examples of her original statuary to be at least partially restored and displayed in museum collections around the world, including significant holdings at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, whose own excavation team conducted much of the pioneering archaeological work at Deir el-Bahri during the early 20th century. The precise chronological timing of this campaign of erasure and the precise identity of the specific individual or individuals who ordered and directed it remain subjects of genuine ongoing scholarly discussion. While the campaign has traditionally been attributed directly and personally to Thutmose III himself, acting presumably out of some combination of personal resentment regarding his own extended subordinate position during Hatshepsut's reign and broader political or religious concerns regarding the ideologically irregular precedent that her successful female kingship represented, some more recent scholarly analysis has suggested a somewhat more complex picture, including specific evidence, suggesting that at least some portion of this erasure campaign may have occurred considerably later during Thutmose's own extended reign, potentially connected to his own efforts to secure a smooth, uncomplicated succession for his own son and eventual heir, Amenhotep II, rather than representing an immediate, emotionally driven response occurring directly upon Hatshepsut's own death. Careful stratigraphic and stylistic analysis of the specific erasure work at different monument sites has, according to some scholarly reconstructions, suggested a possible chronological gap of perhaps 20 years or more between Hatshepsut's death and the beginning of the most systematic phases of this erasure campaign, a chronological gap that, if accurately reconstructed, would considerably complicate any simple narrative of immediate, emotionally driven vengeance occurring in the direct aftermath of her death. This alternative interpretation suggests that the erasure campaign may have reflected genuine, considered political calculation regarding the maintenance of clear, uncomplicated dynastic succession precedent, rather than simple personal vengeance or simple personal resentment, since Hatshepsut's successful precedent of full, independent female pharaonic rule, however genuinely successful and however genuinely legitimate it may have been during her own lifetime, potentially represented an ongoing complication or an ongoing alternative precedent that could, in theory, have been invoked by future royal women seeking to claim comparable authority, a theoretical possibility that a pharaoh concerned with maintaining smooth, uncomplicated succession for his own male heir might have genuine political motivation to systematically discourage through this kind of comprehensive erasure of the specific historical precedent that Hatshepsut's own successful reign had established. Under this interpretation, the erasure campaign represents not personal animosity toward Hatshepsut herself, but rather a calculated, forward-looking political strategy intended to prevent any future repetition of the specific kind of unconventional, gender-irregular succession arrangement that her own reign had represented, a strategy whose timing, connected to the specific needs of securing Amenhotep II's own eventual succession, would help explain the apparent chronological gap between Hatshepsut's death and the beginning of the most intensive phases of monumental erasure. Whatever the precise motivation and whatever the precise chronological timing, The genuine scope and genuine thoroughness of this erasure campaign meant that Hatshepsut's reign remained genuinely obscure and genuinely poorly understood within the broader historical record for many centuries following her death, with her genuine achievements, including both the celebrated peaceful accomplishments and the genuine military campaigns we have examined throughout tonight's story, only gradually becoming clear to modern scholarship through the patient, careful archaeological and Egyptological reconstruction work that has been conducted over more than a century of dedicated modern research. Rediscovering Hatshepsut. Let's spend some time now considering the genuinely fascinating process through which modern Egyptology gradually rediscovered and gradually reconstructed our current understanding of Hatshepsut's genuine historical significance. A process that illustrates both the genuine challenges that ancient historical erasure campaigns create for subsequent historical understanding, and the genuine ingenuity and genuine persistence that modern archaeological and historical methodology can bring to overcoming these challenges. Early modern Egyptological research, conducted during the 19th century as European scholars began systematically documenting and studying Egyptian monuments and Egyptian inscriptions following the broader wave of scholarly interest that Napoleon's Egyptian expedition and the subsequent decipherment of hieroglyphic writing by Jean-François Champollion had helped generate, initially encountered considerable confusion regarding Hatshepsut's specific historical identity and specific historical significance, precisely because of the systematic erasure and systematic name substitution that Thutmose III's campaign had accomplished. Early scholars, encountering monuments depicting a pharaoh using traditional male royal titulature and traditional male royal regalia, but whose name had, in many cases, been altered or removed and replaced with other pharaohs' names, struggled to develop a coherent and consistent understanding of exactly who this particular ruler had actually been and exactly how her reign related to the more clearly documented reigns of the male pharaohs whose names appeared, in various contexts either alongside or in place of her own original identity. Some of these early scholars, working with incomplete and inconsistent evidence, initially proposed various erroneous theories regarding this puzzling ruler, including suggestions that the surviving evidence might represent two entirely different individuals, one male and one female, whose respective identities and respective reigns had somehow become conflated or confused within the surviving fragmentary monumental record. The gradual scholarly process of correctly identifying Hatshepsut and correctly reconstructing at least the broad outline of her genuine historical significance developed over many subsequent decades, as increasingly sophisticated archaeological excavation, increasingly sophisticated philological analysis of surviving inscriptions, and increasingly careful comparative study of the various monuments bearing evidence of her original presence and subsequent erasure gradually allowed Egyptologists to develop a considerably more coherent and considerably more historically accurate understanding of her genuine reign and her genuine achievements. This process included genuinely significant archaeological discoveries, including the excavation and painstaking reconstruction of numerous fragmentary statues recovered from disposal pits near Deir el-Bahri, work that has continued, in various forms, into relatively recent decades, with ongoing archaeological and conservation work continuing to refine and continuing to expand our understanding of her original monumental self-presentation. The specific discovery and identification of her actual mummified remains, achieved only in the early 21st century through careful comparative analysis, including the matching of a specific tooth found in a small box inscribed with Hatshepsut's name to a gap in the dentition of a previously unidentified mummy that had been stored, somewhat neglected, in the Egyptian Museum's collection for many decades, represents one of the more recent and more genuinely dramatic chapters in this ongoing process of historical rediscovery, finally providing modern researchers with direct physical access to her own preserved body, allowing for the kind of forensic analysis, including apparent evidence suggesting she suffered from diabetes and possibly bone cancer in her later years, that has further enriched our modern understanding of this remarkable historical figure. This process of historical rediscovery has itself become a genuinely significant subject of scholarly and popular interest in its own right, illustrating broader questions regarding how historical memory can be deliberately manipulated and deliberately erased by subsequent political authorities, and regarding the genuine methodological challenges and genuine methodological opportunities that modern historians and archaeologists face when working to reconstruct historical truth from beneath layers of deliberate systematic erasure and deliberate systematic historical revision. Hatshepsut's case, in this respect, provides a genuinely instructive and genuinely significant example that extends considerably beyond the specific historical details of her own reign, illustrating broader principles regarding historical methodology and historical reconstruction that remain genuinely relevant to how modern historians approach numerous other cases of deliberate historical erasure and deliberate historical manipulation across many different historical periods and many different historical civilizations. The modern popular fascination with Hatshepsut, reflected in numerous popular historical accounts, museum exhibitions, and broader cultural engagement with her remarkable story, itself represents a genuinely interesting historical development, reflecting broader modern interest in questions of gender and political authority that resonate with contemporary concerns in ways that have helped elevate her specific historical case to a level of popular recognition and popular interest that considerably exceeds what the relatively limited and relatively fragmentary surviving evidence, considered purely on its own narrow historical terms, might otherwise be expected to generate. A genuinely interesting example of how contemporary cultural and political concerns can shape and can amplify particular historical narratives in ways that connect ancient history to distinctly modern questions and modern preoccupations. What the military evidence actually tells us. Let's take some time now to carefully and honestly synthesize what the specific military evidence we have examined throughout tonight's story actually allows us to confidently conclude regarding Hatshepsut's genuine military achievements and genuine military legacy, distinguishing carefully between what the evidence firmly establishes and what remains more genuinely speculative or more genuinely uncertain, consistent with the careful, critical approach to historical evidence that we have tried to maintain throughout all of our various explorations of ancient Egyptian military history. We can establish with reasonable confidence that Hatshepsut personally authorized and personally claimed credit for genuine military action in Nubia during her reign, evidence supported by multiple independent sources including the Sihel Island inscription and the tomb evidence regarding official military honors that we examined in Part 4. This evidence firmly establishes that her reign was not, contrary to certain popular characterizations, entirely devoid of genuine military activity, and that she did exercise genuine, active pharaonic military authority in at least this specific frontier region during at least some portion of her extended reign. This conclusion alone represents a genuinely significant corrective to the more simplified popular narrative that sometimes presents her reign as purely and exclusively peaceful, a narrative that, while understandable given the genuine prominence of her building programs and her Punt expedition within the surviving monumental record, does not accurately reflect the full, genuine scope of her exercise of traditional pharaonic authority. We can establish with somewhat less confidence, but with genuine supporting evidence nonetheless, that her broader exercise of pharaonic authority, including the celebrated Punt expedition and the extensive building programs for which she remains most popularly known, depended significantly on and connected directly to this broader framework of military security and military frontier control, illustrating that her reign's more peaceful achievements should not be understood as somehow separate from or contradictory to traditional pharaonic military responsibility, but rather as complementary achievements built upon the foundation of effective military security that her Nubian campaigns and her broader maintenance of Egyptian frontier authority helped establish and helped maintain. This interpretive conclusion, while genuinely less directly and less explicitly documented than the more straightforward factual evidence regarding her specific Nubian campaigns, nonetheless represents a reasonable and genuinely well-supported synthesis of the broader pattern of evidence we have examined throughout tonight's exploration. We must acknowledge genuine uncertainty regarding the specific scale and specific character of any military activity she may have authorized in the Levantine region specifically, recognizing that the relatively limited surviving evidence does not allow for confident, detailed reconstruction of her specific policy and specific military activity in this particular frontier region, while also recognizing that this evidentiary limitation should not be simply and automatically interpreted as definitive proof of complete military inactivity in this region, given the genuine possibility that relevant evidence has simply not survived or has not yet been discovered and properly interpreted by modern archaeological and historical research. This acknowledgement of genuine uncertainty represents an important and necessary component of responsible historical analysis, resisting the temptation to fill genuine evidentiary gaps with either overly confident claims of extensive military activity or, equally problematically, overly confident claims of complete military passivity, when the honest, careful assessment of the available evidence simply does not support either of these more definitive conclusions. We must similarly acknowledge genuine uncertainty regarding the precise motivations behind Thutmose, the third subsequent campaign of monumental erasure, recognizing that the traditional popular narrative of straightforward personal vengeance, while certainly possible and while certainly consistent with at least some of the available evidence, represents only one among several genuinely plausible historical interpretations that responsible modern scholarship continues to actively debate and continues to actively investigate through ongoing archaeological and historical research. This genuine scholarly uncertainty regarding motivation should not be understood as somehow diminishing the genuine, well-established factual reality of the erasure campaign itself, which the extensive physical evidence we examined in Part 10 establishes beyond reasonable historical doubt, but rather as an honest acknowledgement that the specific psychological and political motivations underlying this well-documented historical phenomenon remain genuinely more complex and genuinely more difficult to definitively establish than the simple, single-cause explanations that popular historical narratives sometimes favor. What emerges from this careful, honest synthesis of the available evidence is a picture of Hatshepsut as a genuinely significant and genuinely accomplished pharaoh who successfully exercised the full range of traditional pharaonic responsibilities, including genuine military authority and genuine military achievement, during a reign whose subsequent historical memory was significantly and deliberately shaped by her successor's own political and ideological concerns, a picture that requires us to move considerably beyond the simplified popular narrative of Hatshepsut as a purely peaceful, purely building-focused alternative to more conventionally militaristic pharaohs, toward a more genuinely complete and more genuinely historically accurate understanding of her reign as a comprehensive, successful exercise of traditional pharaonic authority in essentially all of its traditional dimensions, including the specifically military dimensions that her popular historical reputation has until relatively recently, tended to significantly underemphasize and significantly underappreciate. What Deir el-Bahari remembers. As we bring tonight's story to its close, let's reflect on the genuine, lasting historical significance of Hatshepsut's remarkable reign. A reign that, despite the genuinely extensive campaign of erasure that her successor undertook following her death, has ultimately proven impossible to fully suppress or fully eliminate from the broader historical record, surviving instead through the patient, careful work of modern archaeological and historical reconstruction that has gradually restored her. Genuine achievements, including her genuine military accomplishments, to their proper place within our broader understanding of ancient Egyptian history. Hatshepsut's successful navigation of the genuine ideological and religious challenges that her assumption of full pharaonic authority presented, achieved through the sophisticated combination of religious legitimation strategies, effective administrative governance, and genuine military achievement that we have examined throughout tonight's story, represents a genuinely remarkable historical accomplishment that deserves recognition and understanding on its own terms, rather than simply as a curious historical footnote or a simple precursor to her more famous stepson's subsequent, more extensively documented military conquests. The specific combination of intellectual sophistication reflected in her divine birth narrative, practical administrative competence reflected in her successful management of officials like Senamut, and genuine military capability reflected in her Nubian campaigns, together represent a genuinely impressive portfolio of royal achievement that stands comparison with the accomplishments of any of the male pharaohs whose more extensively documented reigns we have examined throughout our various previous explorations of Egyptian military history. The genuine military campaigns she conducted in Nubia, however less extensively documented and less dramatically commemorated than the kind of elaborate royal battle narratives we have examined regarding Ramesses II at Kadesh or Ramesses III against the Sea Peoples, nonetheless represent genuine exercises of traditional pharaonic military authority, conducted successfully enough to receive continued formal military honors and continued formal royal commemoration throughout her extended reign, evidence that firmly establishes her genuine capacity for effective military leadership, regardless of the specific gender-based ideological challenges that her position as a female pharaoh presented within the broader framework of traditional Egyptian royal ideology. Her successor's subsequent campaign to erase her memory, whatever its precise motivations and whatever its precise chronological timing, ultimately failed to achieve complete and permanent historical erasure, a failure that modern archaeological and historical scholarship has, over more than a century of patient, careful research, gradually transformed into one of the most genuinely compelling and genuinely significant stories of historical rediscovery and historical reconstruction available anywhere within the broader field of ancient historical studies, illustrating both the genuine power that political authorities can wield in attempting to shape and control historical memory, and the genuine limitations that even the most systematic and most determined campaigns of historical erasure ultimately face when confronted with the patient, persistent work of subsequent historical and archaeological investigation. The temple at Deir el-Bahari stands today as one of the most visited and most celebrated monuments in all of Egypt, its terraced colonnades and its remarkable relief carvings, including the surviving portions of the divine birth narrative and the celebrated Punt expedition reliefs that Thutmose's erasure campaign failed to completely eliminate, drawing visitors from around the world who come to appreciate both the genuine architectural and artistic achievement that this remarkable monument represents and the genuinely compelling human story of the woman who commissioned it, a woman who successfully claimed and successfully exercised the full authority of Pharaoh in a system that had never previously accommodated female kingship on this scale, who conducted genuine military campaigns to protect and to extend Egyptian frontier security, and whose memory, despite her successors' genuinely extensive efforts at systematic erasure, ultimately proved impossible to fully suppress. The Nile continues its patient flow past Deir el-Bahari, as it flowed past Hatshepsut's own funeral procession, past the initial stages of her successor's subsequent campaign of erasure, and past the many subsequent centuries during which her genuine achievements remained obscured beneath layers of deliberate historical revision, before modern archaeological and historical scholarship gradually restored her rightful place within our broader understanding of ancient Egyptian civilizations. Remarkable multimillennial history, a history that, as we have discovered throughout our various explorations of Egyptian military history, continues to reveal genuine new insights and genuine new complexities even regarding periods and personalities that popular historical memory has long since settled into comfortable, if occasionally genuinely incomplete and genuinely misleading, simplified narratives. Sleep well. Good night.